Greetings and salutations. This is a video about audio. In this video, I'm going to talk about some of my favorite records. This video is by request. I've had people that have come along and said, hey, we know that you're into music and stuff like that. Why don't you talk a little bit about your records? Well, I used to post videos like that. There's a few of them that are probably still here, but it's been quite some time. And you would have to be a very dedicated follower of the channel because this channel has morphed through the years. I started out talking about tape decks and turntables and records and things like that. And then as the time progressed, it got more and more into technology and Linux. But every now and again, I will do a video like this. So this is how this is going to work. I am going to show you slides because I don't have a decent camera right now, so I can't put the camera on the tripod and sit down and pull the records off the shelves and out of the bin and go, ooh, look at this. So what I did was I looked at the pictures that I have taken and pulled some pictures off the internet. Most of the pictures are of records. I also have pictures of some of my favorite turntables that I've owned since I got back into records in 2010. I'm going to share those with you. It's in no particular order. We're just going to scroll through and talk about it. I really wish that I could share music on YouTube without getting busted. Because if I could, I'd have a ball. There's so much stuff that I would love to be able to share with you guys. But it just doesn't work out. I've had friends who have tried to do it even if they didn't monetize their channels and they tried to follow all the rules and they were getting copyright strikes and busted. So I have avoided it. But at least I can show you the album and talk about it, and that's what we're going to do. The first picture here is an oddity. I started a forum called JC's Phono Works about 4 or 5 years ago on Facebook, and it's still there. And this was a little meme that I came up with right around the time that I launched that forum. And it's a picture of me holding an Edison diamond disc. A diamond disc was Edison's attempt at high fidelity. For those of you who don't know, Thomas Edison is credited with inventing the phonograph. He is the first person to come up with a practical way to record and reproduce sound. Other people had been able to do wave traces in one way or another, but they didn't have any way to play it back. But Edison actually came up with the system. And his first system was cylinder-based. And then a fellow named Emil Berliner came up with the spinning records that are the ancestors of the ones that we still have today. So when you talk about a Berliner record, there's certain technical things about that. They turn at about 78 RPM. They have a certain size groove, all that kind of stuff. Edison didn't like disc records, but when he came out with a disc system around 1912, he came out with one that beat the crap out of what Berliner was putting out at the time for many, many reasons. It was a real attempt at high fidelity in the acoustic era. These records are weird even today. They're hard to play. You would have to have a turntable that you could adjust to spin at 80 RPM. You would have to have a cartridge that you would rewire to read what was in the groove because it's vertical modulation, all that other stuff. So that's kind of an inside joke with this picture. It won't fit in any of my drives and it won't play on anything. There you go. I just picked this record up somewhere along the way, and it's a curiosity that I have up on a shelf and show people every now and again. It's a conversation piece or something that you can use to bore the crap out of somebody. And that's the picture we're going to start out with. So, first record we're going to talk about, and by the way, no particular order. This is just I threw a bunch of pictures in and we're going to talk about them. The first record we're going to talk about is Supertramp's Crisis What Crisis. This album was released in 1975, and it will give you some idea of what my musical tastes are. My musical tastes are wide-ranging, but my favorite music comes from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I'm into some of the 50s music and some of the 90s music, but really that 30-year stretch there, the rock and roll era as it is called, is what I'm into and what I collect from. It's worth noting that the rock and roll era is generally considered to start in June of 1955 when Bill Haley and the Comets had a #1 hit with Rock Around the Clock. And then I kind of ended in 1990 when Vanilla Ice had a #1 hit with Ice Ice Baby. Why? Because it wasn't rock and roll, that was hip hop. And after that record came out, everything just sort of splintered. We started to get into grunge and alternative and dance and pop and techno and hip-hop, and it really wasn't the rock and roll era anymore, that kind of mainstream mix of stuff. Just a little side note. This particular record, I'm a big fan of Supertramp. If you don't know who that band is, that's a progressive rock band from England, and they kind of picked up where the Beatles left off. They explored all of this orchestration and very interesting music, very, very British sound in their music. And this album was probably, from just a musical perspective, one of the best things they did. Now, there was no big hit off of this in the United States. There was a single that was released called Sister Moonshine, which is a really good song. The best tracks on this for me, Another Man's Woman, Ain't Nobody. I like those. I love Poor Boy, which is on side 2 of this record. Really an interesting record. So that's the first one we're going to start out with. And being a Supertramp fan, you know I like Breakfast in America, which was their big album from 1979. I won't even get too much into that because pretty much anybody who knows anything about music knows about that record. It's one of my favorites, but I'm trying to avoid the common stuff here. We want to talk about slightly weird records in this video. One of my favorite artists is Gordon Lightfoot, and he's got kind of a folky country sound. He started out in the 60s recording for United Artists. He recorded 7 albums for United Artists in the 1960s, none of which did anything in the United States. And in 1970, he got a new recording contract with Reprise Records, and this was the first album that he released on Reprise. The original name of the album was Sit Down Young Stranger, which is one of the best songs on this record. But what happened was the record company had put out a single called If You Could Read My Mind, and that started to go up the charts. So what they did is they reissued the album with the name If You Can Read My Mind. They just changed the name of the record. That way people could find it, because Gordon Lightfoot already had stuff in some record stores, so they wanted to make sure that, yes, this is the album that contains the hit, If You Could Read My Mind. So this is really a coming-of-age record for Gordon Lightfoot, and I just love everything on it. I highly recommend this record if you like stuff like that, if you dig that kind of sound. Sit Down Young Stranger is just absolutely a wonderful thing. Gordon Lightfoot's a little bit different from the other folky artists like Dylan, or even some of the deeper stuff. Like most of the folk stuff to me is a little too rough, let's put it that way. Gordon Lightfoot, he was really into harmony. He was classically trained, so even on these records where he was just playing a guitar, the harmonies and the different keys that he works in at the same time is very polytonal, very interesting to listen to. So definite record to look for is If You Could Read My Mind. And if you can find the one that's called Sit Down Young Stranger, that's worth something, because that's a very early release. The one I have is actually a reissue, probably from about, 1985. Sounds wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful. Bruce Hornsby and the Range. This is a very interesting record. It's live, The Way It Is tour, 1986-87. This was never commercially released. This was sent out to radio stations. Bruce Hornsby is from the area that I grew up in. He's from Williamsburg, Virginia, and I grew up down the road in Portsmouth, which is the area that I'm in now. And there was a fella that used to be on the radio around here named Les Wooten, who was Bruce Hornsby's dorm mate when they were going to college. So he's kind of the local boy done good. And I love piano players, jazz piano. That's my main thing. I always wanted to be a pianist, and I took lessons for a long time, and I didn't really have the ear for it. It was very difficult. If I wanted to learn a piece to do in a recital, I would have to really, really, really work at it. I never developed an ear. So somewhere midway through my teens, I said, well, I'm not going to be able to do that, and I kind of walked away from it. But I have the greatest respect for anybody who can play a piano well, and nobody plays a piano like Bruce Hornsby. Now, a kind of an ironic note about this record is that I picked a track off of here called Prelude to the Way It Is, which is the only place that I'd ever seen it released was on this record, which I heard it on the radio. I didn't actually own this record until 2000 and something. I bought it off a collector. And the other place that it appeared was he had a single in 1988 called The Valley Road, and the flip side of that was Prelude to the Way It Is. So I did a demo years ago on YouTube where I used that particular piece of music to demo a turntable. And his manager, or whoever it was, decided to put a strike on my channel for a copyright violation. And at that point in time, you couldn't get those strikes removed through YouTube. And it was a third-party strike. And if you've been around for a while, you know what that's about. I'm pretty sure that's still floating around these days. So I actually had to go fight Bruce Hornsby to get that taken down. And that was kind of a bummer. It's one of those things that, you know, you really like somebody and, oh man, your homeboy done good, and I went and saw him in concert and I loved it, and I always told people how wonderful and how nice, and then you end up in a situation like that. They didn't realize at the time that when they did that that's what it did to your channel. So maybe I did some good, because I know later on that some people tried to post Bruce Hornsby music and they sent them a note and said, would you please take this down first? No, they just put a strike on your crap and you were stuck with it. And it was because of that album. So I have no idea how many copies of this were pressed. I doubt very seriously that it was over 10,000. So if you ever come across it, it's good music, number one, and number two, it's a very interesting record. The record itself was recorded for a radio show called the King Biscuit Flower Hour, and the record company decided to get the King Biscuit Flower Hour's tapes and reissue it to radio stations, just as a way to push the band and push the album that they were trying to sell at the time. And for some reason or other, they never issued it. It could have been because maybe the King Biscuit Flower Hour people didn't want that to happen. I remember hearing the King Biscuit Flower Hour show, and then later this popped up. So that's where that came from. Dave Brubeck's greatest hits. Dave Brubeck is a jazz pianist that I was very much fascinated with when I was learning piano, and loved to listen to his records. Huge fan of jazz anyway. This record is probably from about, I date this to about 1968, maybe. Don't really know. There's not a date on the jacket, but it's somewhere in there that they came out with this greatest hits, because that was about the time that Columbia started issuing these greatest hits albums. And if you can find this is really a great collection of some of the best stuff that Dave Brubeck ever did. And Brubeck is highly collectible, especially the original pressings of his records. I always look for the original pressings if I can get them, unless they're like really super expensive. If it's like a kind of a stock reissue that's a couple years later, I don't care about that. I mean, I don't necessarily have to have the absolute first pressing, but if you can find one of these, I highly recommend it. And this is a test record for me, because Tio Macaro, who is the fellow who was the producer for all of these Brubeck albums that were recorded on Columbia in the 50s and 60s, when they went to stereo in 1958, they came up with a pretty standard way to mic up the group. It's a quartet, So they put Dave Brubeck all the way in the right channel on piano, and then Paul Desmond is slightly to the right, Gene Wright playing bass is slightly to the left, and they took Joe Morello on drums and they stuck him all the way over in the left. And every record is like that for the entire time that they recorded stereo. So if you hear a Brubeck record and you hear the drums over in the right channel, something's wrong, either on your system or they screwed it up when they pressed it or whatever. It's supposed to be that way. The Police, Zenyatta Mandata, one of my favorite albums of all time. When the world is running down, you make the best of what's still around, and Driven to Tears. That to me is just very cool. I remember when this record came out that the Police were they came through our area before they became a big band. A lot of the new bands that were coming up in the late 70s and early 80s, they did a kind of a nightclub circuit on the East Coast. We had a place around here called the King's Head Inn, which was a club, and these bands would come through here, and the local radio stations would actually like broadcast from there, and they'd get these deals where they would broadcast these concerts. One of them is the Police, and somewhere here on YouTube you can find that. Look for K94, which is the name of the radio station, K and 94 and the Police, and you can actually find that concert if it's still up here on YouTube. It was a while back. So this is a band that my sister, who's like 7 years older than me, she actually got to see play before anybody knew who they were. And the first time that I heard of them actually breaking out was this album's in Yada Mandada, because they had a hit, da do 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 da da da, and remember getting this record and going, hey, it's those dudes. And so I'm a Police fan as well. It's a real big tie for me. I think I like this record better than I do like Synchronicity or Ghost in the Machine than from the Police. It's just this particular album, to me, there's just a lot of really cool stuff going on it. Here's a picture of the turntable that I'm using now. There's a video up here where I talked about it. It's the Audio-Technica LP5 turntable. I'm still digging it. The only thing that I've changed about it is I did swap in an upgraded LP gear stylus on the AT95EX cartridge that this came with, but I've set it up and just let it run, and I've absolutely loved it. You can check out the video that I have on it. I still think it's cool. Nothing's changed, and I've been using it for quite some time. Another turntable that I really liked an awful lot was this Technics Q300. And this was my main turntable for quite some time. Excellent quality, and it's got a P-mount cartridge on it. I think that's got a AT92E on it. I actually I still have the cartridges. The turntable got messed up, unfortunately. What happened was that my cat knocked it off the top of the table. She jumped up on it, hit it just the right way, and it fell down behind, and the tone arm snapped, and I was very mad, and that cat's very lucky to be alive today. But this was my main turntable for quite some time. If you can find one of these in good condition, jump on it. They sound absolutely wonderful. And you can still get the cartridges. You can still get P-mount cartridges. Audio-Technica sells a wonderful... somebody said that they had discontinued the 92E, and they were upset about it. And now they have another one. It's like the AT85, which is really good. It's actually an improvement. So yeah, you can still get P-mounts. And if you don't know what P-mounts are, well, it's just the plug-in cartridge that goes on the end of the tone arm. That kind of tone arm was developed by Technics around 1980. It's called a T4P arm, and they sold millions of them, and a lot of other a lot of people who made turntables, I almost said record companies, but people who made turntables had those. So I got a bunch of Beatles records, but I'm not going to talk about them because people, everybody shows their Beatles records, right? But I did want to kind of point this out because if you can find an original pressing, and this is in America, of this set of albums, you're going to be kind of, I don't know, this falls under the category of, gee, that's interesting, but is it the greatest? Technically, no. Capitol Records in the United States, when they got a hold of the Beatles tapes, remixed them, mastered them for stereo, did all kinds of goofy stuff to them. And people in England don't really know this, but in America, we got a slightly different kind of Beatles experience than you did. They sounded a little bit different. And this collection was put out in 1973 by Capitol Records without George Martin's input, who was the producer, without asking John Lennon or Paul McCartney or anybody. They just put these things out, and they are the American single masters for these songs. And they sound very different than what you may have grown up with. If you are young and you didn't hear them the first time around back in the 60s and 70s, or if you are from England and you heard the originals that were released in mono during that period of time, you didn't hear these. So they're fun to look for if you can find them. I have the blue one. I'm looking for the red one. Beatles-wise, I also have a very funky issue of Abbey Road that I have been told came out about 1985. It's very weird. It's got the Apple label, but it's white, and that particular, later on, about 1995. Did I say 95 or 85? I meant 95. And I picked it up for $4 in a record store, sealed. It's very strange. I also have the United Artists version of the Hard Day's Night soundtrack, which is really strange because it's got all the incidental music from the movie on it. But I didn't take a picture of it to show in the video. Everybody shows their Beatles stuff, but these are the weirdest ones. If you can find them, and the original ones that they came out with in 1973 will be on Apple, but these were reissued several times, so you still got it right if you come across ones that have blue and red capital labels. I used to have those when I was a kid, the blue and red capital labels for these records. But anybody who even halfway claimed to be into music back in the 70s and 80s would have a copy of this. All right, one of my very favorite artists. I told you I like piano. I told you I was classically trained. I told you I like jazz piano. Well, this guy's got it all going for him, and that's Billy Joel. So I have pretty much collected every Billy Joel album, again, on records that I had on CD. I used to have them on records back in the 70s and 80s when they were new, and then I got rid of my records, and I had to have them all back. So these are the 7 albums that Billy Joel recorded with Phil Ramone as the producer. And that starts with The Stranger in 1977, 52nd Street in 1978, and then Glass Houses in 1980. In 1981, Songs in the Attic came out. Songs in the Attic was a live album of songs that Billy had written and recorded before The Stranger. The Stranger was really when he became a huge star. Before that, he was kind of bubbling under, and then he moved forward. The Nylon Curtain was recorded in 1981 and 82, released in 82. That's one of my very favorite Billy Joel albums. It's kind of a dark record for Billy. And then it's a return to his youth with An Innocent Man, where he kind of does 60s flavored sounds and just a pop record there. And then The Bridge, which was the last album that he recorded with Phil Ramone. And Billy says that he was not a big fan of the album, The Bridge. And then after that, he started experimenting with other producers and other band members. And I still listen to it, but actually this is the core of the really good Billy Joel period of time. By the way, the band that he recorded with on these records, including Liberty DeVito on drums and Richie Cannata playing saxophone, and Russell Javers on guitar. Doug Stegmeyer played bass on all of these records that you see here. I think maybe not on The Bridge. He passed away sometime in the mid-'80s, and he was the bass player in the Billy Joel band there. Anyway, the band was called the Lords of 52nd Street. They got dubbed that title when they recorded the album 52nd Street. And they're back together, and they kind of play in the New York City area. I follow Liberty DeVito, who's the drummer for Billy Joel, worked for him for 30 years on Facebook. And Liberty and I have been kind of distant email acquaintances for quite some time. I got lucky to be able to have an exchange with Phil Ramone before he passed away. I just sat down one day and sent him an email and told him how he had something to do with so many of the records that I really loved, that I really dug his work, and I was very surprised that I got a response. And he was just a very nice man. He was a Facebook friend of mine on Facebook up until he died, and he's got a great book out called Making Records, and a lot of it is about his time with Billy Joel, because there was a real wonderful thing that went on in the studio on these records. These records were recorded sort of live in the studio. They would do the whole song fully formed as a band, and then they would go back later and maybe add some strings or add something to it. It was a different kind of recording style. It wasn't the way that you think of records being recorded in bits and pieces and, laying down backing tracks and then putting things over top of them. It was a very different recording style, which gave these albums a very unique sound. So there you go. This is the 7 best Billy Joel albums, in my opinion. Another thing that I'm really into is collecting original 45s from the 80s. If I can get 60s, 70s, 45s from any era, singles. When I started out in radio back in the 80s, radio stations were still playing these records on the air or putting them on cartridge. This is how the record companies were sending them. Sometimes you'd get a 12-inch promo disc, which was really nice if you could get those. But a lot of the times, if you walked into a pop radio station or some sort of contemporary radio station, it really didn't matter. You just see stacks of 45s everywhere. And so I have been recollecting them. I've had a thing for singles since I was really young. And this is Cheap Trick's The Flame. And it's just one of the records that I got. This is a picture. I think I pulled this off the internet of this picture of this one, because you notice that the quality's not that great in the picture, but you get the idea. This was another thing I did for that audio forum. I just was playing around with Impress, which is the LibreOffice software that you use to make slides, and I decided that I would do my top 5 favorite albums, and I don't know whether that holds true. I just did it. Number 1 is Billy Joel's The Stranger. That album really was my introduction to seriously being into music and realizing that it was more than just pleasant noise playing on the radio in the background. It was really the first album that I heard on a good stereo. When I was a kid, I was probably about 8 years old when that record came out, and I just remember being blown away by the sound and feeling a connection to the music, and it was just almost like it just touched something in my soul. My next favorite album would be Donald Fagen's The Nightfly from 1982. That's another album that did me that way. I remember I heard that for the first time and I was going, I don't know what that is, but I want more of it. And so I kind of went off into a Steely Dan jag. While other kids were into new music in the mid-'80s, I was looking for Steely Dan albums. And Donald Fagen, of course, a founding member of Steely Dan. Next record on there, A View from 3rd Street by Jude Cole. That was released in very late 1989. Had a couple of hits off of it. One of them was called Baby It's Tonight, probably the biggest one. House Full of Reasons got on the radio. Time for Letting Go was another one from that record. Jude Cole is a songwriter who is very good at singing and writing songs and playing guitar, and just never really made it big. He had that one album, View from 3rd Street, that got him some pop success, and then he sort of was just never able to follow that up. But he's made several albums since then that are actually pretty good. Paul McCartney's Ram from 1971, actually credited to Paul and Linda McCartney. It's a solo record that he was made during the time that he was fighting all the other Beatles, and they were going through all of their bad aftermath. So it's kind of a weird record. It's him and Linda, and they're just picking up. This is before he formally put together the band Wings, and the biggest hit on that one was a song called Uncle Albert Admiral Halsey. Very strange record indeed. And by the way, Phil Ramone had something to do with that record too. He recorded a lot of the mixing and recording was done at A&R Studios in New York, which was owned by Phil Ramone. And so I didn't know that until I read Phil's book, and I was like, I didn't know you worked on that record. That's cool. And then Breakfast in America by Supertramp from 1979. That was recorded after the band had picked everything up and moved out to California from England, and it was their impressions of being in America from a British perspective. Very good album. Take the Long Way Home, logical song, awesome stuff. Different kind of music here. When I first started in radio school, we had a radio station that was owned by the city of Chesapeake. They still own it. It's WFOS. And the school ran the radio station, but it was a full-time station. And believe it or not, they wouldn't let us play any rock and roll. It was classical music or jazz. And I wangled my way into doing this jazz show. And I really got into a place where I really dug it. And one of the albums that they had in the library out there, behind there's Sinatra's Songs for Swingin' Lovers, but I don't really want to talk about that because that's one of those, yeah, everybody talks about that record. But this is the Four Freshmen In Person Volume 2. The Four Freshmen was a singing group from California. They had a hit called Graduation Day. They had a series of albums on Capitol Records that were released in the 50s, mid-50s through the late 50s, that were really interesting. They did stuff like the Four Freshmen and Five Trombones and stuff like that. There's another song that they had called Angel Eyes, which I really liked. They toured with the Stan Kenton Orchestra. They were a huge influence on the Beach Boys. If you listen to the Four Freshmen, it doesn't take you long to figure out exactly where Brian Wilson came up with the harmonies. He was a huge Four Freshmen fan, and he was the first to be able to take those sort of sophisticated jazz harmonies and move them into rock and roll. This particular album came out about 1963, and it's In Person Volume 2, which means there's a Volume 1, and I've never heard the Volume 1. This was in the library at the radio station. I remember it well. I put it on tape. I took it home. I still have the tape filed away somewhere, the cassette tape. And I got curious one day if I could actually find a copy. And I found it on eBay. And this record showed up. And it was like I had jumped in a time machine, went back to 1963, picked this record up at a record store and took it home. It was never played. It was unbelievable. It wasn't sealed, but it was obviously extremely well taken care of. And not only that, it was the mono version. I didn't even want the stereo version because the record that I had heard back in the 80s when I was in radio class, was the mono version. That was exactly what I got. I've played it twice. I'm kind of scared to play it. It's in perfect condition. Unbelievable album. I recommend Four Freshmen anything to anybody, anywhere, if you like smooth harmonies and jazz, because that's what they put together. But this was a guilty pleasure. I've got a CD somewhere that has the Four Freshmen and Five Trombones and the Four Freshmen and Five Trumpets, and they did a pretty decent job reissuing it, but it's not anywhere near like that warm depth of the record. It's not as good. In the same vein, kind of weird music now. This is not too long. I've posted this song called Morse Mode on several different videos. Anytime that I would need music in a video, I would use that. I've posted it on and off for a long time. George Shearing is a pianist. He was a blind jazz pianist who recorded a lot of albums for Capitol Records in the 60s. And most of it was kind of schlocky, easy listening stuff, but his stuff was just an extra cut above because he was an exceptional pianist. There was a guy that I grew up listening to on the radio named Bob Calvert, and Calvert used the song Morse Mode as his theme song before I was born, when he was doing a jazz show on WGHFM in the 60s. I met him in the 80s when he was doing a jazz show on WHRO, which is the local public station, and he was still using Morse Mode. And so I got a copy of this album from Bob that was stamped promotional copy from when it came out, and I held on to it for years, and of course it got given away. And I decided I want that record back. Well, turns out it's never issued on CD. Capitol has essentially deleted it from the catalog. There was no big hits off of this thing. It's just a kind of a weird record anyway. And I found a guy in Japan who had one of these, and I bought it off of him. And I had it shipped from Japan. And it's Shearing today. And the one that I got was sealed in the plastic. I was extremely lucky. I don't know how it ended up over there, but it came to me. And this is another one that I've played like 2 or 3 times because it simply doesn't exist. But what I'll do is I'll pull music off of this and use it as a soundtrack on YouTube, simply because of the fact that it was never put on CD. It's never been put in any Sonic Solutions things, any audio recognition software doesn't know what it is, so it can't flag any copyrights. Now, if Capitol decides to reissue it next week on a CD and it ends up getting put in, it might retroactively get me busted, but so far so good, right? Oh, this is a record player my brother picked up for me in a thrift shop. It's a little portable GE record player from the 60s, and it runs on like 4D batteries. And no, I don't actually play records on it, but I threw the picture in here to break things up a little bit. Here's another turntable that I had, and it's playing Billy Joel's The Stranger is on there. I'm pretty sure that's what that album is. And this was a GLI Pro turntable that I've done some videos on in the past. That machine, I wore it out, man, just completely. And enjoyed that. It was a very nice turntable. It's sort of it was a Technics 1200 clone. Not built as well, but a turntable that I certainly enjoyed for the 3 or 4 years that I had it. And then I sold it to somebody in Texas. It lives on. But, Here's an album that I just picked up a couple of days ago. This is the kind of record that I look for. If I can find it, I love to find records that are in the plastic, sealed, and have those promotional stickers on them from the record company. Now, this particular record is the Honey Drippers, Volume 1. It's an EP. It only has 5 songs on it. And the Honey Drippers were actually Robert Plant and Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck from Led Zeppelin and Jeff Beck group fame, with Paul Schaefer, the same guy that was on the David Letterman show for years, and a few other studio musicians. They put some songs together and put out this record. And they had a hit off of it with a remake of Sea of Love. I ended up getting this record when I was in high school, when this was new. And I never quite forgot the record, you know what I mean? And I got this feeling out of the middle of nowhere. So, okay, go on eBay now and look at it. It's the way it works with me. I don't really work too hard to find records. I just be like walking along and I'll go, hey, I want that. And then I'll find it. This was one of those situations. So that showed up the other day, wrapped up, ready to go. This is the eBay picture the guy took of the record. And I got it and played it, and it's in perfect condition. I don't know. It's like that Four Freshmen record I showed you a little while ago. I don't know where these records have been sitting for 30, 40, 50 years. This record was untouched 35 years. So it was somewhere for 35 years. Where was it? That's just wild, man. Joe Jackson's first album called Look Sharp. And this is a picture of... I think this is a picture of my record, or I pulled it off the internet. No, I pulled it off the internet because it's got that little weird thing going on down there from eBay. I think I got this when I bought it. I'm not sure where the picture came from, but that's not the point. The point is that Joe Jackson's first album is called Look Sharp. Joe Jackson is a British artist who got signed to A&M Records, started out when he was very young. He was like 19 years old. It was kind of like pub rock, and punk kind of mixed together. And the first album was released in this 10-inch LP format, 2 LPs, 10-inch LPs, and it has this little pin that came with the record that you could put on your lapel that said Look Sharp. And there was a big promotional thing from the record company when it first came along. I found this record on sale online for like $10, outside of without shipping. I had to pay extra shipping. Sealed. The person didn't know what they had. And so that is my record copy of Look Sharp by Joe Jackson. And he's one of my favorite artists. This album has the songs Is She Really Going Out With Him? It was the big record off of that. I always liked Happy Loving Couples off of this record. Sunday Papers is one of the better ones. One More Time is one of the better songs on there. If you kind of like grittier, kind of punky rock, that's good stuff. Another Joe Jackson album. Now we fast forward a couple of years here, and now we've got Joe Jackson doing something completely different. This is sort of an avant-garde, jazz-influenced album, poppy sort of thing, called Night and Day. This was after he had moved to New York City. The album that he had recorded before this and put out was a straight jazz record called Joe Jackson's Jump and Jive. I also have that one, but didn't include it in the slides. This record, I remember, of course, everybody heard the song Steppin' Out. And I remember being very intrigued by Steppin' Out and Breaking Us in Two, which were the 2 big hits off of this record. And I absolutely had to have it. And when I got the record, it was just so weird. I loved it. Side 1 especially, the night side, it's just weird. It's weird music, man. TV Age. There's a song on here called Cancer. Trying to Find Chinatown. Great album if you like weird kind of avant-garde trying to put on airs kind of music, I guess you could call it. In the 1980s, that was cool, you know. In the early 80s, it's like, yes, we're going to take pop music and make it very sophisticated and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, it is what it is. 45s, I love 45s. There's another picture that I have. Joey Scarberry, The Greatest American Hero theme. This was a record that I always wanted, and I happened to mention that to my girlfriend Cindy, and she got it for me and showed up, and it was like brand new. Not a picture sleeve, but it wasn't an original Electra Asylum Record Company sleeve there, so just threw that in there. The first really good turntable I ever owned, and it wasn't like a BSR sound design, certain Radio Shack kind of deal. This is an Akai. I'm trying to remember what this is. I think it may be an AP02. This was a direct drive turntable. They were put out in the mid 80s, and they were semi-automatic. It took a P-mount cartridge on it. I actually had this thing loaded up with a really nice Shure RX T6 cartridge at one point. That had a stabilizer brush on it and everything. Really fine sounding little turntable. This turntable, I mean, I had other turntables come and go, but this turntable kept working for 10 years. I used this off and on for 10 years. This was a really good turntable, believe it or not. And at the time, they were relatively cheap. They probably cost, I don't know, maybe $75 if you went out and bought one on its own. But they were really well made, believe it or not. Joni Mitchell, Court and Spark from 1974, with an all-star cast on there. You got Jose Feliciano and James Taylor and David Crosby and all kinds of people playing on this record. One of my very favorite studio musician guitarists of all time, Larry Carlton, is on this album. And this is an original pressing where you don't have the name of the album colored. It's just sort of raised up. So if you come across that, that's how you're going to know you got an original. And later they colored that in so it would be easier to see on some later issues. But yeah, Joni Mitchell's Court and Spark with the textured sleeve there. Just a fantastic album. Another 45. My Daddy Was a Milkman by the Kentucky Headhunters. I was looking through eBay once again, looking through somebody's list of records that they had, and this popped up, and I absolutely had to have it. The Kentucky Headhunters were from the Lexington area in Kentucky, and they were kind of a mix between, I don't know what you'd call it. It was like kind of like I just really strange stuff. Anyway, go find this song. My Daddy Was a Milkman. If you are any at all fan of kind of like rock and country music, I guess is the best way to put it. It's the best thing that they ever did, and it appeared on their first album, and so I absolutely had to have it when I saw the record. Another thing that I really like about 45s, and I had a friend of mine out in California who had a channel called Hitstown USA. Unfortunately, he retired it because the copyright police got after him so bad, even though he was trying to follow all the rules. He had this channel that he posted a lot of his records, and we got to talking, and we've kind of traded things back and forth, and he sent me some records. I've sent him some records. And one of the things that I'm really into is radio service records, which are records that come from the record company that the radio stations would order if they needed a copy of it. These records would also end up in the bins in record stores. They were reissues, basically. Like, this is a Columbia Hall of Fame, More Today Than Yesterday by the Spiral Staircase. That was a one-hit wonder song from 1969. He sent me boxes of these because a lot of his records came out of KSTN and KFRC, two big radio stations out in San Francisco. And I remember these records from my days in radio. Like, I would go to work and there would be in my mailbox a 45 and a note on it that said, could you please put this on a cartridge and make it cartridge number 1304 and put it back on my desk. And that's because they had ordered it. It was a song they wanted to play, and they'd have this brand new record, and then they would dump it onto a cartridge for airplay, and then it would go back into the library, and we'd never see them again. And until I went in, waited until the heat was off and went in and stole them. And well, no, I wouldn't do that. The Big Chill soundtrack on my Sony linear tracking turntable. Neil Diamond, the jazz singer. This is an album that is probably one of the best things that he ever did. The movie was awful, but this record had so many hits that made it on the radio. And as an album, it's just very good sounding record. It's just well recorded, well mastered. The guy who mastered this was an engineer named Doug Sachs. And the record not only is interesting, it's interesting musically, and it's interesting for the way it was recorded, and it was the soundtrack to that movie. Probably the biggest hit on there was called America, Hello Again, Love on the Rocks. It's a guilty pleasure. That's the best way to say it. I really love this record. I liked it when it came out. And recommend it for anybody. If you don't know anything about Neil Diamond and why would you listen to that? Give this record a spin. It's actually really well done. That's Donald Fagen's The Night Fly on my Orbit U-Turn Orbit turntable. My Orbit turntable right now is living under my bed in a pillowcase because I have to get a motor to fix it. I got the LP5 and put that on there. The AT LP5, and that's the turntable I'm using right now. So at some point I'm going to put this back in service, probably when I get enough space where I can have two turntables set up, because I really did love my Orbit. I didn't get the Audio-Technica because I didn't like the Orbit. I just really wanted the Audio-Technica, and so there is a picture of it in operation. Fantastic turntable, hand-built in Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. And they have a plant outside of Boston, and you can order these turntables in the United States, and they'll pretty much custom build it for you. Now, the one thing that I did with mine was I went out and got an AT95E cartridge, which is like my favorite cartridge right now, and put it on it. And that was the one thing I did do, was replace the cartridge. But it's a wonderful turntable, gang. Wonderful. Paul Carrack. Name of the album is One Good Reason, and this was kind of a breakthrough for him in 1987. Best song on here is Don't Shed a Tear, but One Good Reason is a good song as well, and Button Off My Shirt is another one. Just a really well done album. And I remember at the time when this came out, he appeared on the David Letterman show, back when David Letterman was on NBC. This was many, many years ago. And I assume that he had been on many of those kinds of shows. And he walked out on stage, and Paul Schaefer was the guy who was the guy who ran the band on the Letterman show. And he turned around to Paul and he said, "I really don't want to do that song again tonight. Can we do something different?" And Paul said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And he says, "Do you know Ain't That Peculiar?" And Paul Schaefer was a very well-known studio musician in New York. He could play anything. And he said, "Absolutely, we can do that." And they did. And so Paul Carrack sang the Marvin Gaye song Ain't That Peculiar, and just blew my head off. And from that moment on, I was a fan. And it was because of this record and seeing him do that on TV. Paul Carrack's been with a lot of groups. He sang with Mike and the Mechanics. Back in the 70s, he sang with a group called Ace. And just wonderful voice. Genesis. This is their 1983 Genesis album. I have several LPs from Genesis, but this is the one that I wanted to show because that's my favorite one. Just every song on this record is good. Mama, That's All was a huge hit here in the United States. Home by the Sea, I remember hearing that on the radio. And we had a local radio station, an album rock station, that used to play both the versions of Home by the Sea back to back. And I love that. Illegal Alien, Just a Job I Do. It's one of my favorites. Taking It All Too Hard. This is one of those records that I put it on. I like every note on the record, and it takes me to another place. So I wanted to highly recommend that. It's well worth finding. U2, The Joshua Tree. Now, the one that I have is a reissue. This is a 180-gram reissue. I do not have the original going back to the 80s. But I still enjoy it very, very much. Mine is one of the Back to Black series from probably about, 8 or 10 years ago. Not my favorite band. I'm not a huge U2 fan, but there is a certain groove on this record that I really, really like, especially like In God's Country. That's one of my favorite records on this album, songs on the album. Where the Streets Have No Name, of course. Of course, in the United States, Within Without You were huge hits. That was another one, and still haven't found what I'm looking for. They beat it into the ground, so I kind of just go through that. But it's a great record. Strange record, but a great record. I want to talk about this one a little bit, going back to 1975. This is Al Jarreau's first album. Al Jarreau is an incredible jazz singer, and some people say that Al sort of sold out in the early 80s. He had a huge album called Jarreau. That was just the name of it, was just Jarreau. And I have that record too, and I have to admit that that's when I first heard Al Jarreau, and I just fell in love with his sound. He had a hits with We're in This Love Together, and that was the first time I think I actually heard him. That probably would have been 80 or 81. And then he came up with that other album. It's a really great album. But this is his first album, and this has Fire and Rain on it, which is just, he does an incredible version of that. Rainbow in Your Eyes. Just a really funky, good sounding, strange mix on this record. It's just very dynamic, extremely dynamic, and you really have to have a good cartridge to get the most out of it. And by the way, the CD sounds awful. I have one of the original reissues of the CD, and it just does not have the depth or the punch that you get off the record. It's unbelievable. So this is one to look for. The one I have, I picked up from a used record store somewhere, and it came out of a radio station. I know that because somebody had timed all the songs and put the intros on the back, and fortunately it wasn't too chewed up. A lot of albums that come out of radio stations are chewed up because they back cue them, but this one was fine. Asia, one of their that was a kind of a super group band from the early 80s, and this was their first album, Asia. Big song off of this, Heat of the Moment, Only Time Will Tell. Soul Survivor was another hit on the radio in this country. And this album was issued on Quiex, which was a formulation of vinyl that was quieter tracking than standard vinyl, and it was popular in the 80s. And they used to send out promo records to radio stations on Quiex, and you could occasionally pick them up in a record store. I have had, through the years, maybe 4 or 5 albums that were on Quiex. Now, these days, I have 2 45s that are on Quiex. One of them is Tears for Fears, Everybody Wants to Rule the World. I have another one on Quiex. I think it's a reissue of a Todd Rundgren record, and on Rhino Records that was done in the 80s on Quiex. Rhino is a company that does a lot of reissues that are audiophile quality. I have the Power Stations record from 1985 on a Quiex pressing. I had at one point Huey Lewis and the News, the 4 album on Quiex, but I don't have that anymore. That was way back in the 80s. I just threw this in here because I somebody was talking about this album, and I remembered that it was issued on Quiex, and I jumped on eBay. It was one of those situations, again, where I just thought of something and said, I wonder if I can find it, and I found it. And I paid like $14 for it, which was a pretty good price because it's in perfect condition. But that's something to look for. And sometimes on Quiex records, they don't tell you on the sleeve that it's Quiex. So here's how you know. You can pick the record up, and it won't be quite black. It's kind of almost like a real dark gray color. And if you hold it up to the light, you can see through it. So if you come across an album from the 80s that you can do that with, that means that you got one on Quiex. Sometimes they were issued without the label saying it was Quiex. But that's how you know. You can just look through it and find out. Cal Smith, Country Bumpkin. Now here's a weird record for you if you're even at all into country. My family is originally from Eastern Kentucky. My grandmother was a huge country music fan to the point of being a groupie and following some people around. And one of them was Cal Smith, who I remember seeing when I was a child live with my grandmother. I didn't know these people were famous. I thought they were friends of my grandmother who liked to sit around and play music. Another one like that was Tom T. Hall. And anyway, this is a weird album that was never reissued on CD as far as I can tell. The big hit off of this was Country Bumpkin. This fellow just has an incredible voice, and he's completely forgotten today. Just that's ancient, as far as country music is concerned. And I do collect some country albums, that the ones that stick out, because not only did I grow up hearing country music, but later on I worked in country music radio for a long time. So I got to know the genre really well, and I don't like everything that's country, but there's a lot of good stuff in country, so I will pick up a good country album when I see one. This is one that I recommend. The one that I have is funny. I bought it off of eBay once again, just looked for the record and found it one day. And the one that I got is signed by Cal Smith, and it was dedicated to somebody named Dolores. So I don't know what happened to Dolores, but I got her record, so thank you. Strange story here. This is Barry Manilow, Manilow 2, and this is this would have been a reissue from about 1975-76 because it's the Dark Arista label. If you are really, really, really lucky, you might find this on Bell Records, and that is what the label it was originally issued on. Right about the time that this album was being recorded, Bell Records was bought by Clive Davis, who changed the name to Arista. And Barry was very afraid that he was going to lose his record contract because the first album that he had recorded for Bell didn't do so well. So Barry Manilow 1, that's the name of the record, it didn't have a hit off of it, but it had the original version of Could It Be Magic on it. And then he recorded this one, and this one had the song Mandy on it. And fortunately for him, that was a runaway hit in very early 1975. That would have been January of 1975. And somehow or another, I have ended up with, since I started collecting records again, seriously, around 2010, just about every Barry Manilow album on record. I don't know how it happened. It just did. And I got to admit, like I said, we're dealing with people who play piano here. I love piano players. Barry Manilow, classically trained pianist, an arranger, a producer, even before he got into his music career, was helping other people to be better musicians. Just nobody was a better arranger or producer than Barry Manilow. And so when I was a kid and they were playing a lot of Barry's records, they caught my ear I just love it. So, you can throw darts at me if you want to and you can laugh at me, but I am a Barry Manilow fan. And this by far was the best record he ever did. There's a song on here called Somebody's Baby that I really like. I Want to Be Somebody's Baby. This record has an edge. None of the other Manilow albums that he ever did had an edge. This one is, there's an air of desperation on this record. Maybe because of the fact that he was afraid he was going to get bounced off of his label. Maybe he was worried that he wasn't going to make it as a recording artist. I don't know. But there's a focus and a sound on this record that wasn't on any of the other records. Very good record. Another good song off of here is Early Morning Strangers. Fantastic recording. And this is a really good showcase of the way New York records, records that were recorded in New York studios sounded in the mid-70s. That's the way they sounded at that time. I've always kind of prided myself at being able to listen to a record and tell you where it was recorded. And in the 60s and 70s, you had LA records, Nashville records, and you had New York records. And they all have their own individual sound. And when I say Nashville, it doesn't mean it has to be country. They recorded all kinds of music in Nashville. But anyway, this is a good example of what New York records sounded like at that time with the musicians that were bouncing around the city. It's a picture of my Sony turntable. This is my Sony linear tracker. I have a very sad story to tell about this turntable. I sold it to a guy in Texas. No, he wasn't in Texas. I sold the GLI to a guy in Texas. This guy, he was somewhere out west, though. He might have been Arizona. It was pretty close to Texas. And it didn't make it through the mail. I packed it as well as I possibly could, but I don't know what happened in it. It ended up smashed, which is really sad. But one of my favorite turntables that I've ever owned to play with. Surprisingly, though, not the best sounding. It should have been a really super good sounding turntable, but it really wasn't. And I tried all kinds of different cartridges on it, and I finally just let it go and let it go to somebody who would love it. And finally, probably the three best Steely Dan albums that there are. Steely Dan's Greatest Hits, 72 to 78. has all of the really good stuff from the early albums on there. And then Asia was released before that album it came out. The Asia did. Biggest Steely Dan album there is. I mean, Gaucho by Steely Dan. These by far are the 3 best sounding records they ever did, just from a purely sonic point of view. So I decided to include the pictures here. The 72-78 was released on CD in Canada, and you can find that if you're really interested. But really, with Steely Dan is one of those groups like Barry Manilow that we showed before. The CDs are just a hollow shell of what the records, the LPs sounded like. Really, honestly, there's just no comparison. Steely Dan was recorded to be on records. And when they reissued the CDs, a lot just got lost in the process. Even the later reissues where they screwed with the audio and ran noise reduction on it and all that stuff. Yeah, no, get the records if you really want to enjoy the sound. So that's it, gang. Kind of losing my voice now, so it means I've been rambling on for quite some time. But I kind of gave you a tour of my record collection, and that's a few of my favorites there. And I hope you enjoyed the video. I really do. And I'll do a video about audio once in a great while when I have something to talk about. Haven't had anything new come along lately, but you never know when something might pop up. So those of you who like these videos, thank you for your feedback and your input. And if you ordinarily watch Linux videos on this channel and you watch this one, I appreciate it. Thank you very much. So I'm signing off, man. I'm going to go see if I can find a drive to put this Edison Diamond disc in, and I'll talk to you all later.